Alistair, the 7th Duke of Blackwood, required a miracle, and he required it by Sunday. The miracle had a name, a cohesive, theologically sound, and politically palatable argument that would persuade the Archbishop of Canterbury to reconsider his stance on the proposed amendments to the Ecclesiastical Courts Act. The Duke, a man who moved through the world with the serene confidence of a planet in its ordained orbit, felt the unfamiliar grit of desperation. His political allies were wavering, the Crown was watching, and his entire legislative agenda for the season hung upon the Archbishop's assent. He sat in his library, a cavern of mahogany and leather that smelled of old paper and settled power, and stared at a stack of documents as if they might, through sheer force of will, rearrange themselves into a coherent strategy. They refused. The Archbishop's position was a fortress, built upon a particularly dense interpretation of Augustinian doctrine concerning the separation of secular and divine authority. Alistair was a master of law, of land, and of men. He was not, however, a master of Augustine. His solicitor, Mr. Hemlock, a man as dry and precise as the legal dust he inhabited, sat opposite him. The core of his objection, Your Grace, remains the concept of civitas terrena. He believes the proposed oversight committee constitutes an unacceptable intrusion of the earthly city upon the city of God. Alistair ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound frustration that he permitted himself only in the strictest privacy or in the company of men like Hemlock, who were less people than they were professional secrets. It is not an intrusion. It is a procedural adjustment. The man is using 4th-century philosophy to obstruct 19th-century governance. He is the Archbishop, Your Grace, Hemlock stated, which was his way of saying the man could use whatever he wished. The Duke rose and paced before the unlit hearth. The house was quiet. It was always quiet now. Since his marriage 6 months prior, a new layer of quiet had settled over the estate, a stillness that was not entirely peaceful. It was the quiet of a held breath. He had acquired a wife, a duchess, as one acquired a title or a piece of land necessary to square off a border. It was a transaction. The arrangement had been brutally simple. Her father, Baron Croft, was a man of breathtaking intellect and disastrous financial sense. He was a philosopher, a theologian, a man who could trace a single thought from Plato to Aquinas to Locke without drawing breath, but who could not balance a household ledger. His debts, primarily to the Blackwood estate, had become a drowning tide. Alistair had offered a solution that was both merciful and practical. He would forgive the debts in their entirety. In exchange, he would marry the Baron's only daughter, Eleanor. It was a suitable match on paper. She was of good blood, if not of high rank. She was educated. She was presentable. He had met her twice before the wedding, a pale, slender girl, with large, watchful eyes and a habit of looking at her own hands. She had seemed terrified and unremarkable, a porcelain doll, as he thought of her. He needed a duchess to manage his houses and produce an heir. She needed a future that did not involve debtor's prison. The terms were understood, if unspoken. He had provided for her, installed her in his home, and then, for all intents and purposes, had forgotten she existed. She moved through the grand rooms of Blackwood Manor like a ghost. He would see her at the far end of a corridor, a whisper of gray silk, or across the vast expanse of the dining table, a silent counterpart to his own silent meal. She was never late, never improperly dressed, never in the way. She ran the household with an unnerving, invisible efficiency that he only noticed by the complete absence of problems. The staff, who had been bracing for a new mistress, seemed to have simply absorbed her into the existing order of things. She was present and she was absent. She was there and she was not there. His thoughts, snagged on the problem of his wife, returned abruptly to the problem of the Archbishop. He needed a mind like her father's perhaps, someone who could navigate the labyrinthine corridors of theological debate. But the old Baron was in his grave, and Alistair was left with his daughter. "I need someone who can speak his language," the Duke said, more to himself than to Hemlock. He stopped his pacing and looked at his solicitor. A thought, desperate and useless, flickered through him. He dismissed it as soon as it formed. My wife, her father filled her head with this sort of thing. Did he not? Hemlock, ever cautious, merely inclined his head. The Baron's scholarship was his life, Your Grace. It is said the Duchess was his only student. Alistair gave a short, sharp sigh of dismissal. A girl's education. A bit of poetry, some passable Latin. Enough to make her a pleasant companion, had she been the companionable sort. It was not the arsenal required for this particular war. He moved to the library door, his mind already churning, discarding and formulating new, inadequate plans. He spoke over his shoulder to Hemlock, his voice low and tight with frustration. "It is no use. She is a pleasant enough creature, I suppose. Quiet, well-mannered, but she cannot impress the Archbishop." He paused, the true heart of his need sharpening his tone. "I need a mind, Hemlock, not a porcelain doll." He pulled the heavy oak door, but did not latch it. He did not see the sliver of space that remained. He did not see the slender figure in gray silk who had been passing in the hall, her hand outstretched to knock, a question about the evening's menu on her lips. Eleanor stood frozen in the corridor. The words did not strike her like a blow. They landed with the cold, quiet precision of a key turning in a lock. Not a porcelain doll. She had heard the sentiment before, in the averted eyes of London society, in the slightly too kind tones of her new lady's maid, in the very architecture of this house that was her gilded cage. But to hear it from him, stated so plainly, so transactionally, was different. It was a confirmation. It was the final neat column in a ledger she had been keeping in her soul. She did not gasp. She did not weep. Her body, trained in years of self-effacement, made no sound. The question about the menu died in her throat. Her hand, which had been poised to knock, fell slowly to her side. For a long moment, she simply stood there, a statue of gray silk in the dim, echoing hall. She looked at the narrow gap in the library door, the sliver of light from the world where her husband lived his real life, a life in which she was merely an inventory item, listed under Duchess, suitable, unremarkable. Then she turned. She did not retreat to her chambers to cry. She walked, with her usual quiet grace, down the hall and into the music room. The pianoforte sat in the center of the room, its polished surface reflecting the pale afternoon light. She usually played for an hour before dinner, simple pieces by Chopin or Field that filled the house with a gentle, melancholic air. It was one of the few ways she allowed herself to exist. She sat on the bench, but she did not open the lid. She simply looked at the closed keyboard. She thought of her father, of the endless hours in his dusty study, the scent of books and ink, the thrill of grappling with an idea so vast it shook the foundations of the world. He had never treated her like a doll. He had treated her like a mind. He had forged her intellect, sharpened it, honed it. It was the only true inheritance he had left her. And here, in this grand house, it was worth nothing, less than nothing. It was an inconvenience, something to be hidden away, lest it disrupt the smooth, decorative surface of her existence. A door closed, somewhere deep inside her. It was not a loud slamming sound. It was the oiled, silent click of a well-made lock snapping into place. She rose from the piano bench and walked out of the room, leaving behind a profound and waiting silence. That evening, the silence began to make itself known. Alistair, emerging from the library with Hemlock at 6, found himself unconsciously listening for the piano. There was nothing. Only the funereal ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The absence of the music was not a void. It was a presence, a change in atmospheric pressure. He felt a flicker of irritation, as if a servant had neglected a minor but customary duty. At dinner, she was seated in her usual place. She wore a gown of deep blue that made her skin look like alabaster. She was, he had to admit, visually perfect, a duchess out of a portrait. But when he looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in weeks, he saw a subtle alteration. The watchfulness in her eyes was still there, but it was shuttered. Her polite inquiries about his day were just that, polite, and nothing more. The conversation was a desert of correctness. "Did you have a pleasant afternoon?" he asked, the words feeling stiff and foreign in his mouth. "Quite pleasant, thank you," she replied, her gaze fixed somewhere just past his shoulder. "I attended to some correspondence." "I did not hear you playing," he said, and was immediately annoyed with himself for mentioning it. A brief, almost imperceptible pause. "No," she said, "I was not inclined to play today." And that was that. The conversation died, and they were left with the sound of silver on china. He felt a growing sense of unease. The porcelain doll had developed a fault line. It was unnerving. His desperation over the Archbishop, however, soon eclipsed all other concerns. He spent Thursday in a state of mounting frustration, drafting and discarding arguments. Every path he took led back to the same impenetrable wall of Augustinian logic. By Thursday evening, he was desperate enough to consider the unthinkable. He would have to ask her, not for an intellectual contribution, of course, that was absurd, but perhaps for some insight into the type of man her father had been. Some trick of rhetoric, some favored turn of phrase that might appeal to a man like the Archbishop. He sought her out after their silent dinner. He found her in the smaller, less formal library, the one she had claimed as her own. She was not reading. She was standing by the window, looking out at the manicured lawns, dissolving into the twilight. "Eleanor," he said, and the use of her given name felt like a clumsy intrusion. She turned. Her face was a placid mask. "Your Grace." The formal address stung, though he could not have said why. "I have a matter," he began, "of some delicacy." He explained the situation, simplifying it, stripping it of its complexities, as one might for a child. He spoke of the Archbishop, the political impasse, the need for a persuasive argument. He watched her face for any sign of comprehension or interest. There was none. She listened with the polite, distant attention of a stranger on a train platform. "The Archbishop is a man of deep scholarly conviction," he finished, feeling foolish. "Your father, he was a similar type of man, was he not? A theologian. My father was a philosopher who had a great respect for theology." She corrected him, her voice level and cool. The distinction was precise, academic. It surprised him. "Yes, well, I wondered if you had any recollection of how he would approach such a man, a particular line of reasoning he might favor." She was silent for a long moment, her gaze turned back to the darkening window. He thought she had not heard, or had already dismissed him. Then she spoke, her voice still quiet, but with a new edge of something he could not name. It might have been irony. "My father believed that the most effective argument was one that did not seek to defeat an opponent, but to offer him a more elegant path to his own conclusion." The sentence was perfectly formed, startling in its clarity. It was not the vague feminine platitude he had expected. It was a strategic axiom. A flicker of surprise went through him, a brief recalibration of his assumptions. "A more elegant path," he repeated, tasting the words. "He often said that men like the Archbishop are not defending a position," she continued, her voice still low and even. "They are defending a universe. To challenge one piece is to challenge the whole. It is seldom effective." Alistair stared at her. Where had this come from? This cool, analytical precision. It was as if a statue had begun to recite trigonometry. He felt a sudden, disorienting sense that he was speaking to a stranger. So what would he do? Alistair pressed, leaning forward slightly. Eleanor turned fully from the window to face him. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, they were not shuttered. They were clear, intelligent, and cold as glass. "He would find the flaw in the universe," she said, and with that, She inclined her head in a small, dismissive nod and walked past him out of the room, leaving him alone with her astonishing, infuriating words. He was left standing there, feeling as though he had been deftly and politely slapped. Find the flaw in the universe. It was both a perfect piece of advice and a complete refusal to help. It was the key to a lock, offered by the one person who would not turn it. The next day, Friday, the house grew quieter still. The staff seemed to move on tiptoe, sensing a shift in the domestic climate. Alistair found he could not work. Her words echoed in his mind. He went to the main library, the chamber of his defeat, and pulled a volume of Augustine from the shelf. It was dense, impenetrable. He read a page, then another, his frustration mounting. He found himself thinking about her. He tried to reconcile the silent, mousy girl he had married with the woman who had delivered that incisive piece of strategic advice. The two images refused to merge. He had purchased a decorative object, and it had, it seemed, developed a mind of its own. Driven by a strange compulsion, he went to her library. She was not there. The room was empty, but it was filled with her presence. On a small writing desk near the window lay a book, left open. It was not Augustine. It was a commentary on canon law, in Latin. He picked it up. The margins were filled with notes, written in a fine, clear, feminine hand. The notes were not summaries. They were arguments, sharp, insightful, sometimes cutting disagreements with the printed text. He stared at the handwriting. It must be her father's, he thought. Fadiwer. She must be copying his notes. The idea that she herself could be the author of these critiques was too far outside his frame of reference to be considered. Yet, the handwriting was undeniably delicate. He put the book down as if it had burned him. That evening, at dinner, the silence was a physical weight. He tried to breach it. "The Archbishop dines with us on Sunday," he announced into the void. "I trust the arrangements are in hand." "They are," she replied. "It is a matter of great importance." "I am aware." He waited for more. An offer of assistance. A question. Anything. Nothing came. She was a placid sea, her depths entirely hidden. He felt a surge of anger, sharp and hot. Anger at her, at the Archbishop, at himself. Why would she not help him? He had given her everything, a title, a home, security, and in his one moment of need, she offered him cryptic riddles and then withdrew into this infuriating shell. "I would value your counsel on the matter," he said, the words tasting like ash. It was the closest he could come to admitting he needed her. She placed her fork and knife together on her plate, the gesture as neat and final as a closing parenthesis. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "My counsel, Your Grace," she asked, her voice soft. "I was under the impression you had little use for it." The words were a direct hit. There was no mistaking their meaning. He felt a flush of heat rise in his neck. She knew. He did not know how she knew, but the accusation was plain. Not a porcelain doll. The phrase echoed in the silent dining room. "What is that supposed to mean?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. "It means," she said, rising from her chair, "that I am tired. If you will excuse me." She left. He sat alone at the head of the vast, gleaming table, surrounded by empty chairs, the portrait of a powerful man, utterly alone. The meal was exquisite. He tasted none of it. Saturday arrived, a day of gray, weeping skies, the final day before the confrontation. A frantic energy had seized Alistair. He sent a flurry of messages to his political contacts, seeking some last-minute angle, some piece of leverage he had missed. The replies were uniformly grim. The Archbishop was immovable. He paced the halls of his own house like a caged animal. Every tick of the clock was a hammer blow. He kept finding himself in places she frequented: the music room, with its closed and silent piano, the small conservatory, where she sometimes read, her library. He was not seeking her out, he told himself. He was thinking. but the house felt haunted by her quiet, deliberate absence. In the afternoon, he was in the main library again, surrounded by his failure. The books mocked him. He was losing. He, the Duke of Blackwood, a man who never lost, was about to be publicly and intellectually humiliated by a clergyman. His valet, a young footman, entered with a tea service he had not requested. The man was nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he set the tray down. The cup rattled in its saucer. "Clumsy fool," Alistair snapped, the tension coiling in his gut finally striking. "Get out." The boy fled, his face white. Alistair immediately felt a wave of self-disgust. He was not a man who shouted at servants. He was losing control. A short while later, there was a soft knock at the door. It was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. She had been at Blackwood Manor since his father's time, a woman whose presence was as fundamental to the house as its stone foundations. She entered, carrying a fresh cup of tea on a small silver tray. "I thought you might have need of this, Your Grace," she said, her voice calm and steady. She placed it on the table beside him, her movements unhurried. She did not immediately leave. "Thank you, Gable," he said, his voice clipped. She straightened a stack of books on a nearby table. "The house is not itself today," she observed quietly. "The house is fine," he retorted. Mrs. Gable turned to him. Her eyes, a pale, faded blue, were full of a deep and unsettling wisdom. "The Duchess is a remarkable woman, Your Grace." Alistair stiffened. "The Duchess is my wife. I am aware of her qualities." "Are you, Your Grace?" The question was gentle, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of observation. Her father was a brilliant man, a mind like a diamond, but he was all air and fire. The Duchess, she has his mind, but she has her mother's earth. She has substance. He said nothing, his jaw tight. "When she first arrived," Mrs. Gable continued, her voice a soft murmur, "this library was in chaos. Your father's papers, your own, centuries of accumulation. 3 scholars from Oxford had attempted to catalogue it the year before and gave up after a month. The Duchess had it all in perfect order in 3 weeks." Alistair looked around the library as if seeing it for the first time. The perfect order, the logical arrangement he had taken for granted. He had assumed a team of librarians had been hired. "She did it herself," Mrs. Gable said, as if reading his thoughts. "In the evenings. She sees the patterns in things, Your Grace, the patterns others miss." The housekeeper gave a small, respectful bow and departed, leaving him alone with her words. "She sees the patterns others miss." The phrase joined the others in his mind, another piece of a puzzle he was beginning to dread solving. The afternoon bled into a desperate evening. Dinner was a silent, wretched affair he barely remembered. Afterwards he returned to the library, the eye of his storm. The deadline was no longer a day away, it was hours. He was defeated, he knew it. He walked over to the section on theology, his gaze falling again on the books she had been reading. He picked up the volume on canon law, its margins filled with her sharp, elegant script. He ran his thumb over the notes, a strange intimacy in the gesture. This was her mind, on display, a mind he had dismissed as decorative. As he flipped through the pages, a small, folded piece of paper slipped from between them and fluttered to the floor. He bent to retrieve it. It was not a letter. It was several sheets of foolscap, folded together. He opened it. The heading was simple: a refutation of the Archbishop's position on the autonomy of the ecclesiastical courts, based on a reinterpretation of Augustine's 2 cities in the context of a constitutional monarchy. His breath caught. He began to read. It was not just an argument, it was a masterpiece. It was intellectually devastating. It did not attack the Archbishop's premise, it co-opted it. It used Augustine's own logic, turning it with the subtle, irresistible force of a river changing its course. It offered the Archbishop not a defeat, but a more nuanced, more sophisticated, more elegant path to the very conclusion the Duke needed. It found the flaw in the universe. He read it once, his heart pounding. He read it again, a sense of awe washing over him, so profound it felt like fear. This was not the work of a student copying her father's notes. This was the work of a master. This was the miracle he had been praying for, delivered into his hands. And it was written in her handwriting. As he stood there, reeling, his fingers brushed against another piece of paper, tucked inside the folds of the first. It was different, older. The paper was worn, the creases soft, as if it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. He pulled it out. It was a letter, his own letter, the one he had sent to her father a year ago, formalizing the terms of their marriage. His eyes scanned the cold, businesslike prose until they landed on the fatal sentence, a line he had written without a second thought, a simple statement of fact as he saw it. The union will be advantageous in settling all outstanding accounts and providing me with a suitable, if unremarkable, duchess. The air left his lungs. He looked from the cold, callous words in his own hand to the brilliant, breathtaking argument in hers. The pattern. Mrs. Gable was right. She saw the patterns. And now, with sickening, brutal clarity, so did he. Anaphora. It came to him in a flood. He thought about the silence in the music room, a quiet protest he had been too deaf to hear. He thought about her polite, empty eyes at dinner, a mirror reflecting his own neglect. He thought about the books, the marginalia, the fierce intellect he had dismissed as a girlish hobby. He thought about his crass, dismissive words to Hemlock, spoken by a half-open door, not a porcelain doll. He thought about this worn, folded letter, a secret wound she had carried in silence for months. He looked at the two documents in his hand. One was the evidence of his breathtaking arrogance. The other was the evidence of her breathtaking brilliance. The space between them was the measure of his failure. It was a failure not of strategy, not of politics, but of perception, a failure to see. He was a fool. The declaration was not an intellectual assessment. It was a visceral, soul-shaking truth. He had been given a diamond, and he had treated it like a shard of glass. The grandfather clock in the hall began to strike midnight. Sunday had arrived, the day of judgment. He did not hesitate. He left the library, the two pieces of paper clutched in his hand, and went to find her. He did not know what he would say, only that silence was no longer an option. The silence had been the crime. He went to her suite of rooms first. Her bed had not been slept in. Her lady's maid, roused and frightened, did not know where she was. A cold knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He began to search the house, moving through the silent sleeping rooms with a growing sense of panic. He found her in the one place he had not thought to look. At the far end of the west wing was a small, neglected conservatory. Its glass was grimy, and the plants inside were either dead or dying, remnants of his grandmother's passion for orchids. It was a forgotten room, a place of decay. She was standing in the center of it, lit by a single shaft of moonlight that pierced the grimy panes. She wore a simple nightdress, her hair unbound. She was looking at a withered orchid, its brown, brittle stalk a monument to forgotten beauty. She looked as lost and as fragile as the plant itself. He stopped in the doorway, his heart aching with a pain that was entirely new to him. This was what he had done. He had taken something living and brilliant and put it in a dark room to wither. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was a raw whisper. She turned, unsurprised, as if she had been waiting for him. Her face in the moonlight was pale and sculpted, a study in sorrow. He walked slowly toward her, stopping a few feet away. He held out his hands. In one, he held her argument. In the other, his letter. "I found this," he said, his voice hoarse, gesturing with the pages of her refutation. "It is brilliant." She said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the other paper in his hand, the letter. "And I found this," he continued, the words costing him more than any political concession ever had. "I believe it also belongs to you." Her gaze flickered from the letter to his face. There was no anger in her expression, only a profound, weary sadness. "I was wrong," he said. The three most difficult words in the English language, and they felt utterly inadequate. They were a pebble tossed into a chasm. Not about the Archbishop, about everything. He took another step, closing the distance between them. "I said, to Hemlock, I said you could not impress the Archbishop." The memory of his own voice, so confident in its ignorance, filled him with shame. The foolishness of that statement is monumental. "I looked at you, and I did not see you. I saw a contract, a convenience, a porcelain doll." He let the ugly words hang in the air between them, a necessary poison. He would not hide from them. "I was blind," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Utterly, unforgivably blind. And I am asking you not to forgive me. It is too soon for that. I am asking you to teach me how to see." For a long time, she was silent. The only sound was the sigh of the wind against the glass panes of the conservatory. He waited, prepared for her to turn her back, to leave him standing there in the ruins of his own making. He deserved it. When she finally spoke, her voice was as quiet as the dust motes dancing in the moonlight. "And what is it you think you will see, Your Grace?" The formal title was a wall, expertly placed. He had no right to cross it. "I will see a mind," he said. "A brilliant mind. I will see a woman of substance and strength, who has endured my ignorance with a grace I did not deserve. I will see my wife, my Duchess. I will see Eleanor." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, the first thaw in a long winter. He made a decision. It was the only one he could make that was not born of his own selfish need. He looked at her argument, the key to his political survival, still clutched in his hand. "The Archbishop arrives for dinner in less than 24 hours, he said. "I will not be using this." He gestured with the pages. "It is yours. The victory would be yours, and I have not earned the right to share in it. I will meet him. I will tell him he is correct, and that I withdraw the proposed amendments. I will accept the consequences." He was ceding the field. He was choosing his own public defeat over the private exploitation of her mind. It was the only act of atonement he could offer, an action, not a word. She watched him, her head tilted slightly. She was assessing him, weighing his words against the long months of his actions. He could see the intricate workings of her thoughts behind her eyes, the patterns she was discerning. "You would do that?" she asked. "You would sacrifice your entire agenda for a principle?" "No," he said honestly. "Not for a principle, for you." That, at last, seemed to reach her. A small, sharp intake of breath. She took a step closer and held out her hand. Not for his letter, but for her argument. He gave it to her. She held the pages, her pages, and looked down at them. "It is a good argument," she said softly. "The logic is sound." "It is perfect," he corrected. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he had spoken his careless words, she truly met his gaze. The wall was still there, but there was a gate in it now, unlocked. "You wish for my counsel now, Your Grace?" she asked, the question hanging in the air. A genuine inquiry this time. "I wish for a partnership," he replied, "if one is still possible, if you will have me." She considered this. "A partnership has terms," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its former strength. "It is not a transaction. It is an agreement between equals." "Name them," he said without hesitation. "Any terms. I do not want your jewels, or your gowns, or your pin money," she said, a hint of her dry wit returning. "I have those. I require a seat at the table. Not just at dinner. I require my voice to be heard. I require my mind to be seen." She paused. "And I require this conservatory to be restored. I am fond of orchids." A smile, small and fragile, touched his lips for the first time. "The finest glass from London, gardeners from Kew. Whatever you wish." "And the Archbishop?" she asked, holding up her argument. It would be a great waste not to use this. A flaw in the universe should be corrected. It is yours to command, he said. No, she corrected him gently. It is ours. The argument is sound, but it requires a duke to deliver it with authority. She looked at him, a strategist planning her campaign. It will be we who use it. Together. We, together. The words were a balm on his raw soul. It was more than he had hoped for. It was everything. The dinner on Sunday was a masterpiece of quiet theater. The Archbishop arrived, a formidable presence radiating ecclesiastical certainty. Alistair greeted him, not with the aggressive confidence of a political opponent, but with the calm respect of a fellow scholar. Eleanor was by his side, no longer a silent accessory, but a composed and watchful presence. She wore a gown of deep emerald, the color of new life, and a single, perfect pearl at her throat. They spoke of trivialities through the first two courses, the weather, the state of the roads, a mutual acquaintance at Oxford. Alistair watched his wife. She was calm, poised, listening. Finally, over the port, the Archbishop turned to the matter at hand. He began to lay out his objections, his voice sonorous, his logic a circular, self-reinforcing fortress. He spoke of Augustine and the civitas terrena. Alistair listened patiently until he had finished. He did not argue. He did not refute. He simply nodded. Your Grace, he began, your erudition on the matter is, as always, profound. You have constructed a universe of impeccable logic. The Archbishop preened slightly. However, Alistair continued, I have come to believe there is a more elegant interpretation, one that reinforces the sanctity of your office while allowing for the practical necessities of the Crown's governance. He began to lay out the argument, her argument. He spoke of the two cities not as separate and warring kingdoms, but as concentric circles, divinely ordered, each with its own sphere of influence, but both ultimately serving the same God. He used the Archbishop's own favored phrases, his own revered sources, but recontextualized them, reframed them. At a critical juncture, as the Archbishop began to formulate a rebuttal, Alistair paused. He turned to his wife. The move was seamless, natural. But my wife, he said, his voice carrying a weight of genuine respect that silenced the table, has given this particular point of doctrine more thought than I. Her perspective on Augustine's concept of rightful rule is one I believe you will find illuminating, Your Grace. Every eye turned to Eleanor. The Archbishop looked at her with polite surprise, a flicker of condescension in his eyes. He saw a duchess, about to offer a feminine pleasantry. Eleanor did not offer a pleasantry. She met his gaze directly. Your Grace, she began, her voice clear and steady. You rely on the interpretation that rightful rule flows only from an authority that is itself righteous. But Augustine himself, in his letters to Marcellinus, concedes that the earthly city, for all its flaws, serves a divine purpose, to maintain a peace, however fragile, in which the heavenly city can flourish. The proposed committee is not an attempt by the civitas terrena to judge the city of God. It is an act of stewardship, ensuring the earthly peace is not disturbed by temporal disputes, however piously they are framed. She did not just recite, she debated. She countered the Archbishop's interjections with precise, unassailable quotes from texts he thought only he had mastered. She did not try to charm him. She did not use feminine wiles. She met him on his own field, with his own weapons, and demonstrated a mastery that was, in its quiet way, absolute. The Archbishop was stunned. His condescension melted away, replaced by a dawning, grudging respect, and then, finally, by genuine intellectual excitement. He was no longer speaking to a duke and his decorative wife. He was engaged in a high-level theological debate with two formidable minds. Alistair sat back, a spectator, at his own salvation. He watched her, and the love that had been a painful, shameful ache in the conservatory blossomed into a feeling of profound, overwhelming awe. He was not proud of her as a man is proud of a prized possession. He was in awe of her, as a man is in awe of a star, a mountain, a force of nature. He had not seen her. God, he had been so blind, and now he could not look away. By the time the port was finished, the Archbishop was convinced, not beaten, but won over. He saw the elegance of the path she had laid for him. The day was won. As their guest departed, Alistair stood with Eleanor in the great hall. The door closed, and they were alone. He turned to her. "Eleanor," he began, but he had no words. She saved him. "It was a good argument," she said, a small, true smile finally reaching her eyes. "It was," he agreed. "But the delivery was what won the day." "We were a good team," she said. "We." He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, a small, warm gesture that felt more binding than any vow. The best. A year later, the library was no longer his or hers. It was theirs. Books lay open on every surface. 2 glasses of wine sat on a small table between their favorite chairs, and a lively debate about taxation policy filled the air. "If you divert the funds from the naval budget, you weaken the trade routes," Alistair argued. "Only if you see the trade routes as being protected solely by ships," Eleanor countered, not looking up from the report she was reading. "Invest the same funds in diplomatic infrastructure, and you secure the routes with treaties, not cannons. It is a more elegant solution." He laughed. "Everything with you is a more elegant solution." "It is the only kind worth seeking," she said, finally looking up at him. The light in her eyes was bright and alive. The porcelain doll was gone forever, replaced by this brilliant, witty, astonishing woman, who was his partner in everything, his wife. Their greatest joint project, however, was not in the library. The neglected West Wing conservatory was now a jewel box of glass and ironwork. Inside, a riot of life bloomed. Orchids of every shape and color thrived in the warm, humid air, their strange, beautiful faces turned toward the sun. It was their sanctuary. Eleanor was standing there now, her back to him, tending to a new, fragile bloom. She was fuller in figure than she had been a year ago, her body softened by the early stages of pregnancy. The new life she carried was a quiet, joyful symbol of the new life they had built together. Alistair watched her from the doorway. He remembered the man he had been, the man who had stood in a library and declared this woman unremarkable. The memory no longer brought a sharp sting of shame, but a quiet, humbling gratitude. Gratitude for the painful, necessary education he had received. Love, he had discovered, was not a sudden passion. It was not a thunderclap or a fever. It was a discipline. It was the slow, patient, and deliberate act of learning to pay attention. It was the choice, made every day, to truly see the person standing before you. He walked into the warm, fragrant air of the conservatory and came to stand behind her. He placed his hands gently on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, her head resting just below his. She smelled of earth and flowers and paper. She smelled like home. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. She tilted her head, looking up at him, her eyes full of a warm, loving light he had once been too blind to recognize. "I am thinking," she said, her lips curving into a smile, "that you learned to see.